So if you have your Bible, please turn with me to Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. So for the next few weeks or so, I want to focus on the parable in the Gospel of Luke. When we read the Gospel of Luke, we're going to find that there's a lot of parable, there's a lot of stories, there's a lot of illustration that Jesus tells. And there's a lot of truth that we find in this parable. So amazing truth that point us to the goodness of God and point us to our faith as well. So the first parable that I want us to look at is the parable of the lost son, the parable of the prodigal son. I think that is a parable probably all of us are familiar with. If you grew up in church, if you grew up in Sunday school, you would have known the parable. You would have known about this parable. But what I want to do today is to take out some of the truth in this parable. And the topic and the message that I want to preach from this parable is this. How do we find our way? How do we find our way back to God? How do we find our way back to God? Can you look at your neighbor and tell them, how do we find our way back to God? Just as there are different seasons in a year, there are also different seasons in our spiritual journey as well. There's also different seasons in our faith. There's also a different season in our walk with Christ as well. There's going to be season in our life where we feel so close to God, but there's also going to be a season in our life where we feel so far from God. There's going to be season in our life where we feel like we're tied with God, where we feel like we're bonding with God relationally. But there's also season in our life where we feel like God is quiet, where we feel like God is so distant, where we feel like God is so far away from us. So, and one of the things that I have noticed, especially with our youth, right, is this. Usually is after the big event. After the conferences and after the big event and after camp is where they feel so close to God. They feel so holy. They feel so righteous. They feel so inspired. And it's a good thing. It's a really good thing. And 2 months after the conference or 3 months after the conference, that fire begin to slowly die out. That relationship, that closeness with God, it seemed to go further and further and further. I mean, it's not just youth. I just want to say, it's not just the youth that experiences, but sometimes even as adults, sometimes we experience that as well. Usually, we experience the closeness of God. We feel closer to God. We feel tied with God. We feel we're drawn near to God. Usually when things are going well in our life, when God answers our prayer, when God answers our request, when God gives us the things that we want. Those are the times where maybe we feel so close to God. Maybe when God doesn't give us what we want, or when God doesn't answer our prayer, or when God doesn't give into our request, maybe in those times where we feel so far from God, in those times where we feel so distant from God. So there are seasons in our life where we feel far from God. There are seasons in our life where we feel close to God. And what I want to talk about today is this. What do we do? How do we find our way back to God? Especially in the season where we feel so far from God. In the season where we feel so distant from God. How do we find our way back to God? And I want to use the story of the parable of the lost son to share some application with you. But first, we need to establish, why do we feel far from God in the first place? Why do we feel far from God in the first place? It might not apply to all of us. It might not be true for all of us. But a lot of time, maybe the reason why we feel so far from God in the first place is because we put our desire, our need above His. We're chasing the things that we want. We're chasing the things that we long for instead of chasing what He wants for us or what He desires for us. And we see this in this story. We see this in the parable of the prodigal son. In verse 11 and 12, it tells us this. Jesus continued. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property between them. The context of this parable, the context of Luke 15, is that Jesus is talking to the sinners. Jesus is talking to the tax collectors. Jesus is talking to the Pharisee. In the crowd, there was everybody was there. The sinners, the tax collectors, the Pharisees. And the Pharisees and the teacher of the law, they were mumbling among each other. We see this in verse 1 and 2 in Luke chapter 15. They were mumbling among each other. They were saying to each other, why is Jesus eating with sinners? Why is Jesus welcoming sinners? In those culture, to eat with someone is to show that you love this person, you welcome this person, you accept this person into your heart, into your life, that you want to be friends, you want to be close with this person. So the Pharisee didn't understand why Jesus is friend with the tax collector. The Pharisee, the teacher of the law, didn't understand why Jesus wanted to be friend with those sinners. So they mumble among each other, and in response, Jesus tells them 3 parables. The parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and now the parable of the lost son. And Jesus began the story of the parable of the lost son by telling them that there was 2 sons. There was a father who had 2 sons. And the youngest son went to the father and he said, Father, give me my share of the estate. When the crowd heard this, when those Jewish people heard this, they would have been shocked. The reason why they would have been shocked is because in those days, you only received your inheritance when your father died. Only when your father died, then he divided the property and gave it to each of his kids. Right? But before the father died, you will never ever have a son to go to his dad and tell them, give me my share of the estate right now, give me my share of the wealth right now. You would never, that was unheard of. And yet here in this parable, Jesus tells us that this younger son, he went to his father and he made such a request. And what that shows us is this. The youngest son, he does not want a relationship with his father. He just wants his father's wealth. He doesn't want anything to do with the father. He just wants his father's property. He just wants his father's estate. Right? And look at verse 13. Tell us, this is how he used the money that he had from his father. Look, verse 13 tell us this. Not long after that, the youngest son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. So after the father divided the property and gave the youngest son his share, he went off. He went off from a far country. He went as far away from his father's house as possible. He went as far away from his father possible. He went in a distant country and he squandered his wealth in wild living. So we see that this younger brother, he does not want a relationship with his father. He doesn't want anything to do with his father. What he really longed for is his father's wealth, is his father's property, is his father's estate. See, a lot of time in our life is like that as well, where we want to enjoy the things of God. We want to enjoy God's creation. We want to enjoy God's gift. We want to enjoy the things that God made, but we don't want to enjoy God himself. We don't want to enjoy, we want God to bless us, but we don't want a relationship with him. We think that we are most satisfied. We think that we are most joyful. We think that we are most fulfilled when we run away from God as far as possible. And that's what the younger brother did. He think that by having a wild living, we think that by having the inheritance, by going away, by living a wild life, he think that those things will satisfy him. He think that those things will fulfill him. Sometimes in our life it's like that as well, where we think that the approval of that person or the attention of that person or the love of that attention is far better than God's love and God's attention, God's approval for us. We think that by living that way, by doing those things, by having God so far, we think that it will lead to a life of fulfillment, a life of joyfulness, a life of good things. But what we quickly learn is that we find ourselves in a mess. We find ourselves in a mess. Not only we find ourselves in a mess, but we feel so far from God. We feel so distant from God. And that's what we see the youngest son did. The reason why he feels distant from God, the reason why he feels far from God is not because the father was the one that moving, but it's because he was the one that moved as far away as possible. Because he was the one that moved to a distant country. So sometimes in our life it's like that. right? When we feel far from God. And the question for us is this: what do we do? What do we do when we feel far from God? How do we find our way back to God? I want to share with you 3 applications that we find here in this parable. And the first thing is this: we have to come to a realization that I am in the wrong place doing the wrong thing. Can you tell your neighbor that? I am in the wrong place doing the wrong thing. I'm in the wrong place doing the wrong thing. We see that this is exactly what happened to the younger son. Right? We see that what we see here is this in verse 17. In verse 17, it tells us this: when he come to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and I am starving to death?" So here the Bible tells us that he have come to his senses. In other words, he have just realized the things that he did. He just realized how bad his situation is. You know, he spent his money on wild living. Not only that, but worse than that, the Bible tells us that he was living in that distant country, and there was a famine in the land. When there was a famine in the land, because he ran out of money, he didn't have any food to buy, he didn't have anything to eat. So he hired himself as a servant. He hired himself, and he was looking after the pig. Not only he was looking after the pig, but he was longing to eat what the pig was eating. Right? And the Jewish people would have understand, because, you see, for a Jew, a pig is an unclean animal. A pig is a very dirty animal. And this young man, not only he's looking after the pig, but he's longing to eat what the pig is eating. So here he would have realized that he hit the rock bottom in his life. He would have realized that he is in a wrong place for doing the wrong thing. And the Bible tells us in verse 17, he come to his senses. He come to his senses, and he say that even the servant in my father's house, they have food to spare, but here I am starving to death. See, for those of us that do have a relationship with God, we would have understand. We would have understand that in the season where we feel close to God, in the season where we are bonded with God, in the season where we are so near to God, we would understand that we have peace regardless of our circumstances. We have joy in every circumstances. We have joy in every situation. We have less worry. We have less anxious, because we're so close to God. We just trust Him. We just rely on Him. And we know that in the time when we feel so far from God, in the time that we feel so distant from God, we can get angry very easily. We can get frustrated easily. We can get worried easily. We can feel anxious very easily because we're so far from God, and we don't have His peace. We don't have His joy. We don't have trusting in Him because we're so far from Him. And that's what this younger son, he realized here. He realized that in his father's house, he had everything. In his father's house, he had food. In his father's house, he had protection. In his father's house, he had love. And now that he's far away, he have lost all of that. He have lost all of that. Sometimes we experience that. Sometimes we experience anxiousness, we experience worry, we experience frustration, we get angry very easily, we sin very easily. Most of the time, it's because we don't draw near to God. Most of the time, it's because we are so far from God. So the first thing that we have to do here is we have to realize that we are in the wrong place doing the wrong thing. And the second application is this: we have to own up to my sin. Own up to my sin. Look at your neighbor and tell them, own up to my sin. Own up to my sin. We see this in verse 18. In verse 18, tell us this. The younger brother, after he think about what he had done, after he think about the fact that there was food in his father's house for the servant, verse 18 tell us this. He said, I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I have sinned against heaven and against you. So what we see here is that the younger son is owning up to his sin. The younger son is taking responsibility for his sin. He's not blaming anyone here. He's not blaming his friend. He's not saying, I'm in this situation because my friend are not helping me. He's not saying, I'm in this situation because I don't have any more money left. Or I'm in this situation because all the friends that I party with want to have money. They all abandoned me. They all rejected me. They're all leaving me. Therefore, I'm stuck here. I'm here. We see, he doesn't blame anyone. He takes responsibility. He owns up to his sin. He said here, he will go back to the Father and he will tell the Father that I have sinned against heaven and I have sinned against you. At some point of our life, we have to do this as well. We have to take accountable for our sin. We have to own up to our sin. We have to take responsibility for our sin because of what we did. Because of the fact that we rejected him, because of the fact that we disobeyed him, we'll feel far. Isaiah tells us this. In Isaiah 59 verse 2, it says this. Isaiah 59 verse 2 said this. It's your sin that have cut you off from God. Because of your sin, he has turned away and will not listen anymore. The context of this verse in Isaiah 59 verse 2 is that the Israelites were complaining. The Israelites were complaining because God was not listening to them. The Israelites were complaining because God was so distant from them. The Israelites were complaining because God was no longer listening to them. So Isaiah responded by saying that it's your sin that cut you off from God. It's because of your sin that God turned away from you. It's because of your sin that God is not listening to you anymore. The American pastor, Pastor Rick Warren, I think in one of his books he said this. He said, when we feel far from God, it's not because God has moved away from us, but it's because we are the one that move away from him. And we see this with the parable of the lost son. He feels distance from his father, not because his father moved away, but because he moved away. So when we feel far from God, most likely it's because we move away from him. Most likely it's because we disobey him. Most likely it's because we chase our own thing, doing our own thing instead of doing what he wants and what his desire from us. So the second thing that we are out to do is that we are to own up to our sin. Look at your neighbor and tell them again, own up to your sin. Own up to your sin. And the third application is this. Surrender our life to God. Surrender our life to God. Look at your neighbor and tell them, surrender your life to God. Surrender your life to God. So after you realize that you are in the wrong place doing the wrong thing, after you own up to your sin, third thing is that you surrender your life to God. And we see this in verse 19. In verse 19, this is the younger brother plan. He said this. He will go back to the father and he will tell the father that he sinned against heaven, that he sinned against his father, and he will tell the father this. In verse 19, he said this, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your higher servants. So here we see that the younger son realized. The younger son realized that when he go back, there is no way he's worthy enough to become the son again. There is no way he can be good enough to become the son again. That's why here he's planning to go back and tell the father that make me like one of your higher servants. See, what he did was worse than just spending his dad's wealth. What he did, it cost his father his own life. I think Tim Keller, he made this point. When he comment on this parable, he said this, when in verse 12, when the younger brother go to the father and say, give me my share of the estate, and the father divided his property between them in verse 12. The word property, he said, is in Greek is the word bios. And the word for bios also means life. So the word property is the Greek word for bios, which means life. And what he said was this, in those days, in those culture, right, your life, your wealth, your value, your status, your power, your authority has to do with how big your land is, The bigger your land, the bigger wealth you have. The bigger your land, the bigger authority you have. The bigger your land, the bigger influence you have. The bigger your land, the biggest power you have. Now, you might not understand that, but I know that some of your parents understand that. Because in Burma, it's very similar, especially in the village. You know, who grew up in the village here? Anyone grew up in the village? Some people couldn't know you did it. All right? So in Burma, right? In Burma, especially in the village, the most powerful people are people that has the biggest land. The bigger land you have, the more power you have. The bigger land you have, the more authority you have. The bigger land you have, the more influential you are. Right? And whatever happened in the town, it happened because you gave approval, because you have the biggest land. You have the most money. You have the most influence. And here, what we see is that when the youngest son asked the father for his inheritance, the father divided his property. So that means the father would have lost 1/3 or even half of his property. So what that means is that the father would have lost half of his power, half of his influence, half of his wealth is gone. The youngest son spent it away. So what he did was so much worse. Not only he wasted his father's wealth, but he ruined his father's reputation. He ruined his father's authority and power and influence. In the same way, when we sin, it impacts us more than we think. It impacts God more than we think. What take God to save us is to sacrifice his one and only son. His one and only son. He had to sacrifice his one and only son. He had to give up his one and only son. You know, here the father here in this parable maybe he lost half of his wealth. Maybe he lost half of his power, half of his influence. But the Heavenly Father, not only he lost his wealth, but he lost his own son. He had to give up his own son to save and to rescue us. And the thing about the God that we worship is this. You know, we all know what happened in the story. We all know how the father responded to the youngest son. The youngest son, before he even get home, the father saw him from a distance. The father ran to him and chased after him and hugged him and loved him. The son, you know, he started his apology speech, but before he even finished, the father just hugged him. The father just, get his servant to bring the best robe and sandal for his feet and throw a massive feast. This is the God that we worship. You know, when we return to him, when we long for him, when we desire to be near to him, he'd run up to us. He restore us. He forgive us. He renew us. He welcome us. The son here, the son thought that he will be a servant. But no, the father gave him affirmation that he is a son. He's always be a son. You see, this is the God that we worship. He is so good. He is so loving. He is so kind. So how can we not want to be near to this God? How can we not want to be near to this person? How can we not want to have a relationship with God? You know, it's like this. You know, out of all the friends that you have, probably the friend that you are drawn close to the most, or the friend that love you the most, or the friend that have your back the most, or the friend that, are there for you the most. That's why you're the closest to them, because of their love for you. In the same way, God loves us so much more than we can hope, so much more than we can imagine. So how can we not want to be near to him? How can we not want to be close to him? So in the time when we feel far from him, in the time when we feel distance from him, in the time when we feel like he's so far from us, this is how we are to find our way back. This is how we are to find our way back. Number one, we need to realize that I am in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing. Number two, we need to own up to our sin. Number three, we need to surrender our life to him. Amen? Can I have the worship team to come on, please? I know that, especially for some of the youth that went to Youth Alive conference, I know that you'll probably feel so pumped. I know that you'll probably feel on fire right now because of the conference. But I want to challenge you this. Keep that fire burning. Keep that love burning. Keep it burning through your devotions. Keep it burning through your prayer. Keep it burning through, reading of the Word and get to know Him through other words. And yes, there's going to be time when you fail. There's going to be time where you feel far from Him. But when you fall from Him, why don't we just do 3 things? Realize that you are in the wrong place. Realize that you're doing the wrong thing. Own up to your sin, right? And surrender your life to Him. When we do this, God is already there waiting for us. God is already there ready to give us the best, ready to give us forgiveness and restoration and all the good things. He's just there waiting. So why don't we do that? Should we stand up and worship God?